Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining the evening portion of the annual World Wetlands Day Research Symposium at the University of Waterloo. My name is Philippe Van Capellen. I'm a professor at the University of Waterloo, and I will be your host tonight. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and also that my home is situated on the Haldimand tract, the land promised to the Six Nations of the Grand River. I would also like to ask all of you to take a moment to acknowledge and appreciate the enduring role of Indigenous peoples as stewards of our shared lands, water resources, and of particular relevance tonight, our wetlands. World Wetlands Day marks the date of the adoption of the Convention on Wetlands 50 years ago today, on February 2nd, 1971, in Ramsar in Iran. The convention, which is usually known as the Ramsar Convention, is an international government agreement acknowledging the importance of wetlands, and it plays a central role in the conservation of these critical ecosystems worldwide. Canada is a signatory of the convention and currently has 37 sites designated as wetlands of international importance, or Ramsar sites. Each year on February 2nd, events are held around the world to celebrate wetlands. And at the University of Waterloo, the Eco-Hydrology Research Group has been organizing the annual World Wetlands Day Research Symposium since 2013. This year is our 9th symposium, and it's comprised of a series of research talks earlier this afternoon, as well as this evening's event. And of course, because of the pandemic, this is also the first time that the symposium is held entirely virtual. So we are very grateful to the Waterloo Public Library for agreeing to be the co-host of the World Wetlands Day Distinguished Lecture and the panel discussion. And in particular, I extend my thanks to Christine van Walraven for the technical support this evening. The symposium could also not have been possible without the efforts of my colleagues on the organizing committee, including Harriet Bigas, Lyndon Fairbairn, Ferdun Rezanezad, Maria Strack, Scott Davison, and Steph Slowinski. We also acknowledge the continued support of the University of Waterloo's Water Institute and the Faculty of Science, with special thanks to Heather Neufeld. Just a few housekeeping items. We very much welcome questions and feedback from the public. So if you have questions for the panelists during the panel discussion, please write them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Also, please look out for the survey that will show up at the end of the event. Your feedback on the event will be very helpful in us in planning the World Wetland Day Symposia in years to come. So let me now introduce this year's distinguished lecturer, Dr. Rebecca Rooney. Dr. Rooney is an associate professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Waterloo. She is a wetland ecologist and is recognized as a world expert in the areas of biomonitoring and wetland assessment. Dr. Rooney's research focuses on how human-caused and natural disturbances influence wetland communities, including wetland birds, invertebrates, and plants. Dr. Rooney's research has been important in supporting the implementation of wetland policy, invasive species management, and the protection of species at risk. Also noteworthy, Dr. Rooney recently co-authored a commentary in the Toronto Star that shines a light on the importance of urban wetlands in the Greater Toronto Area, and also the threats that they face. She also wrote an article in the Peterborough Examiner and Quarta Now that describes the gifts that wetlands impart to society. Note that right after a lecture, Dr. Rooney will introduce today's panelists and moderate the panel discussion. I now invite Dr. Rooney to present to us her lecture entitled Wetland Loss When We Know Better. Dr. Rooney.
Thank you very much, Philippe. And thank you to all of the sponsors. It's an honor to be here. So wetlands are what we call keystone ecosystems that sustain natural ecosystem processes and scarce resources across the broader landscape. Our wetlands are holding up a socio-ecological arch, providing water to forests during drought, but also forage for our livestock. They're refugia during fire and containment systems during floods. They're nurseries for fish and ducks. They purify water passing through them and serve as conduits between different ecosystem types and between our surface and groundwater reservoirs. So much of our social, economic, and environmental functioning depends on wetlands, that without them, the socio-ecological arch will collapse. Now, I've been studying wetlands for more than 15 years, and I'm still regularly surprised, blown away by their resilience, their complexity, and their generosity. Wetlands form on the margins of lakes, in the floodplains of rivers, in the puddles and ponds where water collects or discharges from seeps and springs, anywhere that water sticks around long enough to transform the soil and to exclude incompatible plants is, by definition, a wetland. It is these unique soil properties and water-loving plants that we use to delineate the boundaries around wetlands. And these soils and plants are both the result of and the drivers of ecosystem processes that make wetlands so interesting and important. In fact, the Canadian Wetland Classification System bases the first division among wetland types on whether their soils are mostly peaty, rich organic matter, or inundated, clay, silt, or sand. Now, the peaty organic soils will give us peatlands, rich, spongy fens and bogs like this one that I studied, nestled in a valley in the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. Or the expansive fen and bog complexes that blanket the whole boreal region, including the Mackenzie River and the Hudson Bay lowlands down here, which are two of the world's largest wetlands, both located in Canada. In fact, Canada holds 27% of the world's peatlands, the second most after Russia. And recent estimates put the area at 730,000 kilometers squared, an area 2 times the size of Germany. And that's probably an underestimate because many peatlands aren't properly mapped, especially in the mountains. Peatlands support some of the most bizarro members of the plant world, like this parasitic ghost pipe, or the carnivorous pitcher plant and sundew or bladderwort. These are plants that eat bugs or even sometimes amphibians in order to get enough nitrogen to survive in their nutrient-poor habitats. But arguably the most astounding adaptations are found in the humble sphagnum. In fact, a 2019 story in the Guardian newspaper called it the most underrated plant on Earth. So simple that it doesn't have vascular tissue. This hasn't stopped this group of about 350 species from becoming ecosystem engineers. Sphagnum, depicted here, you can see its tissues have these sort of open spaces. These special cells help it hold water so that it can hold actually 20 times its weight in water. It's also able to suck up nutrients like potassium and magnesium from the soil, releasing hydrogen ions. And this changes the pH, making the soil as low as 3, which is about the same as pure vinegar. The combination of acidity and sponge-like quality made sphagnum ideal for keeping babies' bums dry and for dressing wounds. In fact, we were still using it in bandages in the First World War. Many wetland plants possess these type of medicinal properties, but the most important function that sphagnum mosses provide to modern society could arguably be their ability to trap carbon dioxide from the air and store it in the soil as peat, this brown stuff. In Canada, peatlands are thought to hold 150 gigatons of carbon, about 150 billion tons. And there's great uncertainty about this because they're not very well inventoried. And more importantly, it's not a matter of how big a footprint the peatlands cover. It is more important how deep that peat layer goes. And this can be highly variable, from as little as 40 centimeters to as much as 6 meters deep. Or to give you some reference for that, about 3 Raptors players tall. Globally, they're thought to store 2 times as much carbon as all the terrestrial biomass on Earth, 30% of the world's carbon stock. But with climate change, permafrost thaw, increasing fires, and expanding human industrial developments, these carbon stores are at risk. They're at risk of turning into sources of greenhouse gases, including methane, which is 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. The carbon balance of peatlands is changing rapidly, but with unknown consequences for our global climate. The Global Peatland Initiative, of which the University of Waterloo is a member, is an effort by leading experts and institutions to safeguard peatlands as the world's largest terrestrial organic carbon stock, and to prevent them from releasing that carbon into the atmosphere. Restoring peatlands can be a cost-effective way to sequester carbon, but critically, we need to prevent that carbon that is presently stored in peatlands from being released into the atmosphere, as this would contribute catastrophically to climate change. I also work in mineral wetlands, the ones with the clayey, sandy, or silty soil, like this fertile coastal marsh on the sandspits in Lake Erie. These literally buzz with life and harbor an unparalleled diversity of species at risk. Over 26 different species at risk are known to rely on the marshes of Longpoint alone. That's this little 32-kilometer long sandspit here. And bird diversity is especially impressive there. The Longpoint Birding Observatory is the oldest in the Western Hemisphere, and they reported 230 different species observed in 2020 alone. But more than supporting beautiful and rare plants and animals, these wetlands are refuges of green space in highly developed urban and agricultural areas. How do they support such biodiversity? Well, they are incredibly productive. And you can see here in this picture where I'm dwarfed by the cattails around me, how lush the vegetation is. Net primary productivity is a common way to measure this. Basically, it's the difference between the amount of carbon that's sucked up by photosynthesis and the amount that's used by the plants in respiration. Freshwater marshes like these and mangroves can achieve net primary productivity on par with tropical rainforests and coral reefs, some of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. Though on average, most freshwater marshes are about half that productive, which is still roughly 2 times the average net primary productivity of cropland. Oops. Too far. The plant productivity supports an abundant invertebrate population, which in turn supports many fish, birds, amphibians, snakes, bats, and so on up the food web. And what's sometimes called the cryptic base of the wetland food web. And that's these biofilms here. I'm putting a little magnifying glass to see. These not only support all this productivity, but they play a crucial role in purifying the water, helping remove sediments, nutrient pollution, and pesticides. Through combined lab and field studies, I found that these wetland biofilms can bioconcentrate over 20 different pesticide chemicals, collecting them from the water, kind of like a Brita filter. And they actively break down at least some of these, including glyphosate, the most commonly used herbicide in the world. And so this graph here, I'm not going to show you too much data, but in this graph, we have the rate of glyphosate being converted into its primary breakdown product, which is called AMPA. And the green is showing that rate in these tanks when they contain biofilm, compared with the tanks with just filtered lake water, no biofilm. So you can see the rate is definitely enhanced by the presence of this biofilm. This capacity of marshes to purify water is particularly important in the Prairie pothole region, where I also study wetlands, as so many of these wetlands are located right in the middle of farm fields, and they have high exposure to fertilizers, pesticides, and sediment-laden runoff. Many are also impacted by oil and gas extraction. But in this one, you can see they're farming right up to the edge of the wetland and even driving through it. It's thought that over 40% of all wetlands in the Prairie pothole region have already been lost due to farming. And we continue to see losses of over 11,000 hectares each year of prairie pothole habitat across North America. A major cost of all that wetland destruction is borne by birds. The prairie potholes are often called the duck factory of North America, and it's thought that 50% of North America's duck population rely on these Canadian wetlands. The shallow waters free of fish are teeming with grubs that feed many ducks, shorebirds, and other bird species that breed or stage for migration in these wetlands. You can probably imagine the value this presents to waterfowl hunters. But actually, bird watching is taking over. Even before the pandemic, it was one of the fastest growing hobbies in North America. 10 years ago, a survey by the US Fish and Wildlife Service reported nearly $41 billion was spent by Americans on travel and equipment for bird watching in 2011 alone. I'd be very interested to see how much higher those figures are in 2021. Anecdotally, stories in the New York Times, National Geographic, and reports by Audubon indicate that people have really turned to bird watching to find balance and moments of joy during the pandemic. So I hope that our panelists will be able to tell us more about some of the social and traditional values that wetlands provide during our discussion. Another major issue with wetland drainage is that all of the water the wetlands used to hold has to go somewhere. The idea of consolidation drainage was pioneered by researchers in North Dakota. At their study site in Valley City, in this left panel here, it shows the watersheds and the wetlands within them before any drainage took place. And then the panel on the right, the red wetlands have all been drained, and all the water that was in them ends up being consolidated into this terminal wetland, making it deeper and larger and more prone to flooding. This change isn't restricted to prairie pothole wetlands. It occurs anywhere we remove wetlands or where we block the flow through them. Anywhere we do that, we will increase the frequency and severity of flooding and reduce downstream water quality. You can envision individual wetlands as little reservoirs within this big network that snowmelt and rainfall have to pass through. This is the big network, and here's the terminal wetland getting bigger and deeper and more prone to flooding. The more stops the water encounters along its route, then the slower the whole pulse will move downstream, and the lower the height of that ultimate flood peak will be. That's depicted here in this classic diagram from 1983. So we've known this stuff a long time, but we're still seeing wetland loss and we're still seeing flooding as a consequence. This is a growing concern because when we couple wetland drainage with climate change, we're going to be seeing more severe, more frequent flooding that will cost us both in property damage and casualties. I trust that during the panel discussion, Natalia Mudrak will be able to tell us more about this. This Canadian geographic map shows increased flooding is an issue across the country, with floods in the last decade being larger and more costly than ever before. Almost counterintuitively, we're also seeing increasing drought and forest fires because of climate change, especially in Western Canada. But wetlands can help us here too. So I've already mentioned the amazing sponge-like properties of sphagnum mosses that can suck up water when there's a flood and hold it and slowly release it when things are dry. But both organic and mineral wetlands can help mitigate the effects of flooding. Many wetlands discharge water like this, what we call infiltration to the adjacent upland, helping to support increased crop yields if we plant crops around these wetlands, or sustained forest growth in areas where we do logging. And there's been a lot of research on this in Alberta. This can actually boost the yields of crops in dry years and also facilitate groundwater recharge, which is how our aquifers get replenished. But unfortunately, as was shown in this classic paper by Vanderkamp and Hiyashi, if we drain the wetlands, we lose that recharge function. My colleagues Kevin DeVito and Carl Mendoza explain how removing wetlands is kind of a trade-off. You get flashier, more flood-prone landscapes when you take the wetlands away, whereas if you leave the wetlands intact, you have a more steady, consistent supply of water. So in the short, 10, 15 minutes that I've been talking, I've highlighted many of the gifts that wetlands give us, like water purification and protection from floods and drought, like replenishing our aquifers and providing climate change mitigation. I've touched on their value as habitat for species at risk, unique and rare plants, their importance in maintaining productive fisheries, recreational bird watching and duck hunting opportunities. There are other wetland gifts that I haven't had the chance to describe. Paramount among them is that they hold immense spiritual and cultural significance. And I hope that we'll be able to address that also in the panel discussion. But in my work at the university where I teach young people, I see tremendous anxiety about the future. I see students with feelings of isolation from nature and from each other. I see hopelessness. But I think that wetland conservation and restoration can serve as a path to hope and a concrete way that we can come back into balance with our personal value systems that ask us, how can we sit idly by as wetland protections are eliminated? Developments are fast-tracked without due environmental assessment or public consultation, and contaminants are washed from our laundry and factories and farm fields straight into these wetlands. How can we sit idly by when nature has been so open-handed and generous with us? I and my students and colleagues celebrate wetlands every day, but as Philippe alluded, on February 2nd, we ask the rest of you to celebrate with us. Because this is the 50th anniversary of the signing of the International Convention on Wetlands in Ramsar, Iran, This intergovernmental treaty embodies the commitments of its 171 member countries to maintain the ecological character of their wetlands of international importance and to plan for the wise use of all wetlands in their territories. Canada signed this agreement in 1981, and as Philippe mentioned, we've since designated 37 different wetlands as Ramsar Wetlands of international importance, totaling over 13 million hectares. Interestingly, the Ramsar wetland was one of the first of the modern intergovernmental conventions on the environment, the grandfather of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Vienna Convention on the Protection of the Ozone Layer, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. It really set the precedent for international agreements focused on conservation of nature and protecting our shared environment. But according to the 2018 Ramsar Global Wetland Outlook Report, approximately 35% of the world's wetlands were lost between 1970, shortly after this Ramsar Convention was signed, and 2015. And the loss rate is accelerating annually since about the year 2000, especially in inland waters. More, the quality of wetlands that remain is also in decline, with freshwater declining more than marine and terrestrial environments as well. This trend is certainly reflected at us in Ontario, where according to the 2017 Ontario Wetland Strategy document and the 2018 report by the Environment Commissioner of Ontario, historic losses are being added to every year, possibly at an increasing rate. We know how valuable wetlands are. We've even put a cash dollar figure to it. We've known for 50 years this is nothing new. That knowledge drove us to sign the Ramsar Convention and to put in place federal and provincial protections to conserve wetlands. We're afraid of climate change and we need nature-based solutions, but every year we lose more and more wetlands, the most cost-effective and beneficial climate change mitigation available. So I ask, why are we losing wetlands? Why are we losing them? And maybe more urgently, how do we stop? Well, fortunately, that's what this panel is going to discuss. And before we get started and I turn things over to the audience, rather to the panelists, I want to say if any audience members have questions, please submit them to the Q&A feature. So we'll be taking questions after each panelist has had a chance to speak to the overarching question of how we can protect our wetland resources. So if the panelists are ready, I will turn things over to begin with Mike.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. And I think one of the most important ways that we can protect wetlands is to have good public policy in place that's backed up by an informed public that provides the political will to protect wetlands. And so that's one of the reasons having the conversation we're having tonight is so important, because we need an informed public that understands the value of wetlands and why they're worth protecting, and the fact that they're under threat in Ontario. And we've had pretty decent legislation in Ontario around protecting wetlands over, let's say, the last 15 years, but even longer, like the Conservation Authorities Act in Ontario, for example, was brought in the 1940s, strengthened in the 1950s. And many of the policies that protect wetlands in Ontario have been brought in over the last 15 years, primarily governed through the provincial policy statement, which provides guidance for growth, which includes wetland protection, and is then governed by legislation, some of which dates back to the 1990s, such as the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan, the Niagara Escarpment Plan, which even goes back further, back to the Bill Davis era, the Greenbelt Plan, and then the Growth Plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And a lot of that was brought together with a vision of what wetland protection will look like in Ontario till 2030 by the Wetland Conservation Strategy that came out in 2017. But even with all of that, we've lost almost 75% of our wetlands in Southern Ontario. And so that's why it takes the political will. And we've seen in the last few months especially in December when the current government gutted many of the science and evidence-based ways in which conservation authorities protect water and protect wetlands, and related to this conversation, is that even with legislation in place, decisions are made by government that still threatens wetlands and or weakens legislation that's been put in place to protect wetlands. And in some cases, in particular, the use of what's known as ministerial zoning orders, or MZOs, the minister can override the provincial policy statement, all local planning laws, and essentially all the laws that protect wetlands to facilitate development. And probably the most egregious example of that happened just in the last few months, where the current government has issued a ministerial zoning order, much to the displeasure of the City of Ajax, the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, which I'm sure Brad can go into a bit more detail, to facilitate a casino and warehouse development on 57 acres of the Duffins Creek wetland, which is one of the major wetland ecosystems on Lake Ontario in the Eastern GTA. So that's why I say political will is so important, because you can have the legislation in place, but if you don't have the political will and the public support around that legislation, it can be weakened or overturned. I just want to close by highlighting two examples that really highlight this for me that's happened in the last couple of years. So the Greenbelt in Ontario, in some respects, has reached iconic status with strong public will to support it. And so, as many of you probably know, Premier Ford on a few occasions have talked about opening the Greenbelt for development. And whenever he does that, there's such a huge public backlash that the Premier has backed off. And probably the strongest example of that was Bill 66, which was introduced in December of 2018, which would have opened the Greenbelt for development. There was huge public backlash to that, and the government removed that schedule from Bill 66 a couple months later. Likewise, in another omnibus bill, this time the budget bill that was introduced in November, included a schedule that gutted Ontario's conservation authorities, which play an important role in protecting wetlands. And while there was a negative public response to that, it wasn't as big as the public response to the opposition to the Greenbelt. And so the government didn't feel the need to back off on their changes to the conservation authorities and plowed ahead and went forward with them. So to me, it highlights, I think, the importance of establishing wetland protection and the importance of wetland protection to the level of iconic status that the Greenbelt has achieved in Ontario if we're going to have the political will to protect wetlands. And I'm looking forward to everyone's questions tonight.
Thanks very much. Yeah, clearly we need to have the same level of public outcry over threats to our wetlands if we're going to protect them. And now I'll pass the mic, or the virtual mic, over to Natalia Mudrak, Director of Climate Resilience for the Intact Center.
Well, thanks, Rebecca, and our hosts for organizing this event, and everyone who's joined. I want to piggyback on something that Mike said, and also emphasize the great economic value that natural assets in general and wetlands in particular provide to communities in Ontario and in Canada, and in particularly note their value for climate resilience benefits and disaster risk reduction that they offer. But first, just to note how costly climate change and extreme weather is becoming in Canada. One good indicator of that rising cost is looking at catastrophic insurable losses associated with extreme weather events in Canada historically and now. And historically, from 1983 period to 2009, annual catastrophic insurable losses associated with floods, fires, and other events used to amount to $422 million. But after 2009 and through to 2020, that number has changed to $1.8 billion Last year alone, insurance industry paid out $2.4 billion associated with catastrophic losses with extreme weather events. And by far, flooding, having too much water in the wrong place at the wrong time, is the elephant in the room when it comes to extreme weather in Canada. And so this is an indicator of rising costs associated with extreme weather in Canada, but also for every dollar of insured loss, there are $3 to $4 of uninsured losses that occur, that are borne by governments, by businesses, by individuals. So we really need to figure out, how do we combat this trend and flooding in particular. And wetlands, as Rebecca mentioned, act as natural sponges. They help absorb excess rainwater and help reduce these costly damages. And just to give you a concrete example, the Intac Center worked with Grand River Conservation Authority and Stantec Engineering Company to quantify the value of wetlands located upstream from City of Waterloo. And we found out that under conditions of a very large storm, like Hurricane Hazel, so 1 in 500-year storm event occurring in the fall, these wetlands provide $50 million worth of damages avoided in terms of flooding to homes, industrial, commercial, institutional buildings for the City of Waterloo. So if we lost these wetlands to development, then flood damages would be 50 million higher if this storm was to occur. And there are groups across Canada who work with municipalities to calculate the value of wetlands in dollars and cents, to disclose these values in financial position statements and inform asset management plans. And I think these efforts are of paramount importance, because if we do not assess and publicly disclose the economic value of wetlands, we may not even notice their degradation and loss over time. However, if we do, in fact, recognize their value, it makes it easier to inform land use planning decisions, assign maintenance dollars to keep wetlands in good health, just like we assign maintenance dollars to keep roads or any other city assets in good health. So this is my point. Wetlands are important natural assets. They provide many benefits, and the economic value of these benefits should be tracked and should be publicly disclosed, especially in light of climate change, of flooding, and their ability to limit damages. And simply put, keeping natural assets, wetlands, in their natural state helps avert some of the most costly damages. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, clearly there's a cost to climate change mitigation, but it's so much less than the cost of doing nothing. And I think tracking the economic value of wetlands is one of the most persuasive ways that we can sort of take our science and help policymakers understand why it matters. And next, I'd like to turn the virtual microphone over to Dave Mowat, Chief of the Alderville First Nation.
Hi, good to be here. Sometimes the only way I can, or sometimes the only way we can save anything is to jump in our Anishinaabe canoes and cover the waters as a means of putting people on notice that this too is our environment. As a wild rice harvester, and I am looking through the eyes of a harvester, and one that goes into the borders of the wetlands annually for monitoring in midsummer and harvesting by early September, I see the changes from year to year. I am not a scientist nor an academic, but am centered on practice and activism if need be. The wild rice, or Monoman as we call it, is central to our migration story and the history of our Mississauga and Anishinaabe communities of Southern Ontario. I harvest and practice the old way, in which we use a canoe with paddler in front and seeded ricing sticks, and our own knowledge of where the rice is and how it is faring throughout the 3 stages of submerged leaf, floating leaf, and the above water growth stage. We are products of an Aboriginal right and a long line of Indigenous knowledge and its essential geography, practitioners of the laborious processing of the Monoman from harvest to soaking, to drying, to parching, to dancing, to winnowing, to the hand cleaning of the final product. It is a beautiful tradition that requires patience, physical strength, passion, and commitment. When it is placed under pressure, we know about it. When it is thin and being interrupted by an invasion of other species, we see it immediately. But we only know these things by being there. It is when we are there in the rice beds, on the edge of the wetlands, that we can take note of the adjoining wetlands and marshes and intrusions by developments, even minor intrusions. Wild rice provides food for a number of herbivores, and rice worms and other insect larvae feed on it, thereby providing a source of food for small marshland birds. The stem provides nesting material for loons and muskrats. All growth stages provide food and habitat for wildlife while providing excellent breeding and nesting areas for an abundance of species, even for spawning muskies. The rice beds teem with biodiversity, so much so that you can feel and hear it in the insects, birds, the green herons, muskrats, and the fish. When we see shoreline development, however, it raises the alarm bells because our first thought is, who is the land use planner behind this? What employee at the respective conservation authority has been involved in this? What is the local municipality, and what is its views toward its aquatic environment? And what is its level of knowledge of the treaty encompassing these lands in the first place? This is the only way that I know how to bring attention to the importance of our aquatic ecosystems through the monoman, through the wild rice. From experience, I know that being active within them and having an Aboriginal right to practice and protect the rice beds, even in protest if need be, can help to inform a larger audience on the value of the monoman and the broader wetland issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we need people on the ground in the wild rice, paying attention to the land and able to communicate what's going on. And I think that that's such an important service. And I think now as our last panelist, Brad Stevens from the Toronto Region Conservation Authority will hopefully be able to contribute to that topic as well, as someone I know who's often on the land.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Thanks for the invite. In my role at the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, I manage a team of what we call planning ecologists, and their job is to, specific to wetlands, is to take those policies that Mike was talking about and actually apply them with partners, apply those policies onto the ground. And it's an action-packed job, and as you can appreciate, no two sites are the same, so it can be pretty complicated. But in terms of how do we as a society protect our wetlands, I'll take a bit of a policy approach to that to start. And what I would be advocating for is what I would call a strong, clear, and nimble framework, policy framework around wetlands. And what I mean by that is having strong prohibitions against impacts to features to wetlands and their functions, and setting us up to really be able to capitalize on the ecosystem services that those features are providing on the landscape. They're doing lots of great work for us in terms of flood attenuation and habitat provision and flow attenuation, evapotranspiration. The list of functions they provide is endless. Next up, as part of that policy framework, would be clarity. So making sure that there's clarity in that policy and the processes that go with that policy, to ensure that we are consistent and have a very robust method for defining wetlands and determining what management options are available for them, should potential impacts be contemplated to them. And my final point on the wetland policy framework is that it needs to be nimble. So you can appreciate no two sites are the same. In natural systems, nothing's black and white. So there's, regardless of how we define wetlands, or we apply policy, or create criteria to figure out how to navigate the policy process, there are going to be features that are on the bubble. They're going to be in the gray area, and we need a policy framework that's nimble enough to be able to make a replicable decision-making process around that, where the requirements are clearly defined for how to make those decisions, and that we're adequately staffed, and we have the tools available to be able to make those decisions in a timely manner, so that we can get on top of these issues as quickly as possible. Just in closing, I want to mention a few more points about supporting wetlands in Southern Ontario. And in order to maximize wetland contributions to these places where we live, exploring and exhausting wetland opportunities within the landscape, we do have this high level of historical loss. That actually means there are lots of opportunities out there to kind of reclaim that wetland function on the landscape. So through construction of wetlands, restoration of wetlands that may have historically been there. There's one other approach that we can use where if wetland construction or wetland restoration is not possible in the built form associated with whatever development or redevelopment, we can actually implement some of those wetland functions into the built form and try to claw back some of that function in terms of infiltration or evapotranspiration, and even habitat to some degree. There are also great opportunities to make these features part of the urban landscape and actually capitalize on them, and make them a focal point of urban design. And the example that I always use with this is the constructed wetland that's in Yorkville Park in downtown Toronto. So the most expensive real estate in Canada, and there's a constructed wetland down there, and it's beautiful, and it's an integral part of that neighborhood. So I'll close with that. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you, Brad. So I think we're going to take some questions from the audience. And I actually have some questions. I guess one of the privileges of being the moderator is I can ask my own questions first. And I'd like to address this one to Mike, actually. So the Ontario government has a wetland conservation strategy in place to protect and restore Ontario's wetlands. But Ontario's wetlands have been under increasing threat, particularly in Southern Ontario, where we've lost, as we've said, 72% of historic wetlands, or up to 75%, depending on your math. As a member of the provincial parliament and holding the province's only green seat, what policy tools, support, and changes are needed to ensure that these valuable resources receive priority and protection from our government?
We actually need policies put in place that are going to achieve much of what Brad has talked about. And I think one of the most important ones at this point is that we just need a prohibition of development on wetlands, period. We've crossed the line where enough is enough. When you've lost almost 75% of your wetlands, to say, oh, we can take a little bit more, or a little bit more, and a little bit more, is what's led to the chipping away of wetlands in Ontario. And so that would need to be strengthened in the provincial policy statement in particular. But in order to achieve that, I think we as a society have to decide what's valuable to us and what kind of world we want to live in. And if we want to live in a world where we can experience what wetlands have to offer, as Dave has described, and have that intimate knowledge of experiencing them, if we want to live in a world that protects our communities and our lives and our property from the high cost of flooding in particular that Natalie talked about, and if we want to create spaces for people to enjoy nature and to have recreation in addition to those ecosystem services in some ways Brad talked about, then we as a society are going to have to value protecting those ecosystems more than the short-term development that comes from something like a casino and a warehouse, which is the biggest threat to major provincially significant wetland in Ontario, like as we speak right now. And that really comes to speak to our values. And so that's why I talk so much about translating an informed public with the political will to say, no, this development is wrong. No, we should not have development on wetlands, and we'll have the legislation in place to protect them. And we won't create exemptions that allow government to overturn that. And so that really comes down to the kind of Ontario we want for ourselves and for future generations.
That actually makes me think of what Dave was saying about putting the canoes in the water. And so I want to ask Dave a question about, Indigenous communities have this wealth of knowledge about the importance of wetlands and about environmental conservation in general. So how can all stakeholders ensure that that perspective is at the table, that it's a prominent voice in matters of conservation in Wetland Canada and internationally? What role does wetland protection conservation play in reconciliation with Indigenous peoples?
So I looked at that question, and I can't answer it without talking about touching on colonialism and the Indian Act. That is one of the main sources of one of the main forces and sources that didn't care about how Indigenous people felt, what they believed in, what they cared for, what they relied upon, but rather it forced the First Nations into starvation. They starved for food security. They starved for recognition of their lands and their rights under treaty. They starved to see their children again, and then they starved in their bellies. And that is a pretty bleak history, but it's the history of Canada when it comes to Indigenous peoples. And so it's really difficult to talk about where we are now or any wealth of knowledge without looking back at what colonialism and what the Indian Act did to the First Nations people. And I'm not going to talk about, the other groups, but all I can talk from is the First Nations. And so all that mattered under those systems was getting our people off the land, killing the Indian and the child, and eroding Indian lands at whatever cost. It was dispossession at its finest. So when you couple that with the coercive power of the law to force people off the land and out of the wetlands in Southern Ontario, it was no worse than what Johnny MacDonald did to the Plains Cree Indians in the 1880s. We have local Alderville stories of our harvesters being forced out of the wetlands, i.e. on the north and south sides of Rice Lake, specifically after the 1923 Williams treaties, because of the effect of this treaty upon an unknowing people. So our people did not understand the effect of what the Williams Treaty was going to do to them in Southern Ontario. How could it be that our people asked when we have treaties with the king? So since those times, which is nearing 100 years now, we're close to 100 years since the 23 Treaty. Indigenous people have been, that have been known, may have known at Alderville, what they would have known from an Indigenous knowledge perspective, that was brought under assault after 1923. And so we have to be careful when we assume that First Nations today have a wealth of knowledge about the very things the government wanted for itself. Because of where we are, geographically located in Southern Ontario, we were in the way of the Ontario and Dominion governments. We were in the way. So it took all it could take, and depending upon the geographical location of the First Nations in question, that wealth of knowledge became a trickle of knowledge. In Southern Ontario, the Williams Treaty's First Nations, which again are located smack dab in the middle of the most important modern economic hub in Canada, were frankly in the way of progress, quote unquote. So in my community, fortunately, there remained enough knowledge to be taken hold of again. And then since the early 1990s, when our treaty claim began its long and arduous trek through the Canadian court system, to now, in the wake of a successful treaty negotiation in 2018, we can say that our harvesting rights are once again recognized and affirmed. Our voice then can rise again. And it should be incumbent upon other stakeholders to learn of those rights and where and how they can be exercised. But let's be clear, those rights predate all of what Canada is about and never will be. I say, the Crown didn't give us rights, we gave the Crown rights. Our voices and our rights they're not an anomaly. They are a part of the fabric of Canada. So everything from the provincial school curriculum to post-secondary, to being called to the bar, to the conservation officer, police college, civil service, to the refugee claimant, all should be obligated to learn and know what treaty is, what the various treaties say, and what their intent was in assisting the Crown in originally opening up this land. And coupled with that, the same should be applied in the understanding of an Aboriginal right. Finally, wetland conservation and protection would give me hope that there can be some credibility in government. Who is anyone to suggest a wetland is a wasted land? Who is anyone to suggest that a development should eradicate the function of a wetland and decimate its value to not only those creatures that are sustained by it, but by us? 70% reduction and destruction of wetlands in Southern Ontario should be enough to say that society has already failed itself. So when will it aspire to even a passing grade? On the Duffins Creek issue, we've written as a collective, as the Williams Treaty's chiefs, we wrote the minister in regard to that issue, and so we are quite aware of what's going on there. The fact that 35 MZOs, I believe, have been used since this government has been in place should be alarming, and so with that, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that I liked what you were saying about, wetland conservation can give us hope that the government can live up to their commitments. And I'd like to see that happening here in Ontario and around the world. And I think that one of the, most persuasive arguments we have when we talk to politicians is the economic argument. The economic value of wetlands has been demonstrated. It seems the short-term benefits of job creation and casino development, agricultural production have been prioritized over, wetland conservation and the values and functions wetlands provide. So how do we translate the longer-term benefits and services that are associated with wetland protection, economic or otherwise, into public action or policy? How do we reconcile those short-term demands to develop wetlands with the long-term value of protecting them? And I'd like to direct that question to Natalia.
Some heavy discussion we have going on, and this is a heavy question as well. But I think I want to go back to my earlier comments about the importance of putting the value of wetlands in dollars and cents. And we keep on going back to that statistic, how in Ontario, 72% of wetlands have been lost to development. In Southern, it's 95%. So clearly the arguments that we used in the past did not work. So I think that indeed putting the value in economic perspective may be a good chance to bring this discussion back on the policy agenda and generate more interest from different stakeholders in the value of conserving wetlands for the broad range of benefits that they offer. And I find the argument that begins to emerge of wetlands value for municipal service delivery, that is for stormwater storage, for water quality treatment and other benefits to communities, quite powerful. Because if we continue to lose these natural assets that are providing these quote unquote municipal services to the community, we will have to eventually build new infrastructure and spend more money to provide that valuable services to our communities. But I see two other systematic issues that Canada needs to address to solidify nature conservation and wetland conservation long-term, because the question was, what do we do long-term? And I think the first one is changes to public sector accounting rules. Currently, the way that public sector entities prepare their financial position statements, they're not allowed to recognize natural assets as assets on financial position statements. So one of the arguments that's being used is that there aren't enough credible methodologies out there for us to assess the economic value of natural assets to bring them on our financial position statements. And that's an outdated view. And so the second systemic issue that I think also needs to be resolved is the way that cost-benefit analysis are being conducted when we are considering different infrastructure investments. So in a hypothetical scenario, just to illustrate what I mean, let's say we are considering an infrastructure investment that will result in some stormwater storage upstream of a community. We may restore a wetland that will provide some of that stormwater storage benefit, or we may build a water storage tank buried in the ground. So we can run the analysis of alternatives and say, this is how much it costs to build or restore a wetland. This is how much the gray infrastructure solution costs. We can put in dollars and cents the benefits of both of the solutions in terms of the water storage function that they provide. But if we stop short and do not perform a holistic total economic value assessment of other benefits that wetlands provide, such as water treatment, maybe carbon sequestration, maybe some recreational value to the community, then we will systematically shortchange that solution when we're considering green versus gray investment. So if the cost-benefit analysis practice is not expanded to have this holistic total economic value analysis, I would say then we're systematically discriminating against natural solutions in favor of gray infrastructure solutions. And so I think accounting rules need to evolve to start recognizing natural assets and wetlands as actually assets. And if they're lost or degraded, we can actually see it on financial position statements when we review it. And I think we need to be more clear about cost-benefit analysis methodologies when we're making investment decisions into infrastructure, not to shortchange green infrastructure solutions.
Yeah, so we sort of, I think we have these two mechanisms, the economics and the legal, the idea that we need, strong, clear, nimble, as Brad described, policy, no net loss policy, and also that we honor the existing Aboriginal treaty rights we've already committed to. We have this legal sort of arm, and then we have the economic incentive arm if we only fully account for things. I agree with you. I think if we have, if we don't take into account the entire portfolio of gifts that ecosystems provide us, and we're only comparing a natural wetland versus a stormwater pond in terms of its stormwater holding capacity, the natural wetland will always lose. But then that does make me think, Brad, in in the TRCA, green infrastructure like engineered wetlands, river corridor restoration, it's been proposed as an effective response to mitigate the threats from urban growth and climate change, including flooding and water quality impairment. What are the potential challenges, though, for implementing green engineering solutions inspired by natural wetlands in Southern Ontario? And how do we involve communities? How do we measure the success of these solutions?
Yeah, so I think I would first start off with supporting again the idea that the natural features on the landscape currently are going to do the best job in terms of mitigating impacts of natural hazards and keeping the watershed functions going as they are in a pre-development scenario. As far as engineered solutions that are trying to use wetland functions to provide some infrastructure function, in terms of getting those implemented on the landscape, it's really a all hands on deck kind of approach where there are so many factors at play in terms of what challenges look like there. The feasibility of a certain technology, like if we're trying to figure out a way to mimic wetland function either in the form of infiltration or evapotranspiration or flow attenuation, something like that. A common measure or type of measure that we've used over the last 20 years or so is called the low impact development measure. And these can be anything from infiltration trenches to what we call bioswales. Green roofs to some degree can fall into that category as well, or even just a plain old ditch does a really good job. And in terms of actually applying these types of measures to a development project, be it an infrastructure project or a big box development, there are some common challenges there where the site conditions might be more ideal in one location than another for a certain technology. The available land, especially with infrastructure projects. So if you're widening a road, you're paving over more of the right-of-way that you already own, or you might even have to be widening your right-of-way. So there isn't going to be much room to put in a bioswale or a ditch along the side. So we'll have to look. We find ourselves having to look at different technologies to achieve those same functions. There's also long-term operational costs, long-term ownership issues, things like that. And there's even I've run into on a couple of occasions issues like West Nile concerns, which are very real concerns in the community, that if we're trying to hold and store some water on the landscape behind somebody's backyard, they might have some concerns about that. In terms of how do we involve communities, I think it's about educating and working with the communities in terms of fitting these kinds of technologies into the built form and the landscape that they live in. So there's education on the intended function, the aesthetics. It might be a little too wetlandy for people that are used to highly maintained lawns, etc. And another important factor there is local champions, people that are able to kind of get the word out. Other more traditional approaches is simply tree planting, like expanding the urban canopy. That's gonna really help in terms of providing that flow attenuation and reducing those impacts from development. Wetland restoration, straight up wetland restoration opportunities in agricultural areas, or I've seen several locations where public parks, there's opportunity to turn that perennially wet corner of the mowed lawn in the public park, turn that back into a wetland because it used to be one and it really wants to be one again. And then larger scale reforestation projects, community plantings, those kinds of things. Yeah.
I think you definitely echoed what Natalia was saying, that we need to be able to account for it so that there's someone responsible. And I think responsibility in the sense of almost a local guardian, so that I think you called it a local champion. But again, we need someone on the land, someone on the ground who cares passionately about it if it's going to be protected. Yeah. I want to ask Philippe, are there more questions from the audience?
We're currently overwhelmed by questions, comments. It's an amazing reaction here. A lot of the questions or comments are actually already answered by the panel. So I'll rephrase some of those because there's several comments that kind of point to the same thing. But one of the questions is like, well, it looks like the panel, we're all believers in the need to conserve wetlands. So how do we convince the non-believers of the importance of conserving wetlands? How do we go about that? I mean, because it should be ultimately an apolitical question. It's like we all benefit from conserving wetlands. So how do you go about that? And also the associated question is, are there examples of turning opponents into allies?
Well, I wonder who should start with that one. I think, Dave, you were discussing education and potentially turning opponents into allies. Do you want to take a shot at this question?
Well, I'm getting an echo here. Sorry. On the, oh boy, sorry. Can you move it on to somebody else? I'm having a technical issue here.
Sure. Would anyone else like to take a shot at that? Mike?
Yeah, so one of the strategies I've been employing is trying to connect people with where they are and how they benefit. And so it could be through love. Like, I love nature. I love spending time in a wetland. I love paddling. I love hiking. It was one of the things when the government was criticizing conservation authorities for, quote, straying from their mandate by having activities on conservation authorities for the public. And I was like, well, how do you expect the public to not love this place if they don't get to experience it and enjoy it and spend time in it? So that's one. Two is looking at the economic values. And so one of the reasons I think it's really important to look at economic value is to look at things like ecosystem services. So farmers, for example, we can pay farmers for environmental goods and services to either protect existing wetlands on their land or through wetland restoration. So that corner in the field that usually has water that is a pain to deal with anyway, why not just turn it back into a wetland and get paid to do it, because you're providing a societal benefit of clean water and flood mitigation. So there's a clear economic benefit. Respecting treaty rights and Indigenous knowledge. One of the things I do at Queen's Park, and by the way, Dave, thank you for your letter on Duffins Creek. I've been using that as one of many examples to push back on government on that. But so in every bill that comes to any committee I'm on, I try to always push an amendment that requires First Nations consent for development or water taking permit or whatever, because I think those treaty rights are so critically important to valuing wetlands and just Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous traditions, Indigenous ways of life. Another one is looking for unexpected allies. So as an environmentalist, a lot of people don't think hunters and anglers and environmentalists necessarily are are natural allies. Well, I've been reaching out to hunters and anglers big time around wetland preservation. It's like, if you want to go fishing and you want the aquatic life to have healthy fish runs, then you need wetlands, and you need to support and push back against conservation authorities being undermined. So I've been reaching out to hunters and anglers and saying, hey, I know you don't think of environmentalists as your natural allies, but we are natural allies. So let's work together on this. So it's really trying to figure out where you connect with people. Anybody who lives in near floodplain, on a floodplain, I try to explain to people, it's like $43,000 is the average cost to repair a basement damaged from flooding. I live in the Groundwater Conservation Authority. I pay about $2.80 a year to the GRCA to protect my basement from flooding. $280 versus $43,000. I'll take the $280 any day. So it's just
cheap
really,
at the price.
It's a very cheap price. So I'm just always looking at ways that I can connect people to how it benefits them, their family, their community, etc., from a variety of interests. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of that comes down to, do you love this place or not? And if you love this place, you're going to protect it.
And do you care about the future, right?
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Yeah, the wise use and the fair distribution of our resources is something that I think spans all political stripes. Dave, are you able to contribute?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't have my granddaughter here to help me. So when it comes to the wild rice harvest, we do take non-Indigenous people out to experience the harvest. And with that, they also experience, that ecosystem within which we are harvesting. And they learn about our tradition. They learn about a whole host of things, species at risk, what the wild rice beds do. And again, also, we are able then to point out points of development that might be alarming for us. So I don't like to give away all my secrets when it comes to the wild rice harvest, but I'll give enough of them away to at least get people out there and exposed to the harvest. I would be remiss if I didn't mention our own Black Oak Savanna tallgrass prairie here in Alderville First Nation and what I was able to do there over the last 20 years. At the beginning, it took some hard-headedness to convince the council of the day that what we had here was a gem in southern Ontario. And there is a small wetland attached to the savanna, the tallgrass prairie Black Oak Savanna site. It's a 130-acre site in the heart of Alderville on the original surveyed lands from 1835. And so we somehow, some way, it didn't fall victim to the plow. And in 1999, 2000, we, myself and Rick Beaver, we made the move to convince the council of the day that it needs to be protected. And at that time, it was education that we had to use to keep convincing the council of the day and our community members that what we were doing here was of the utmost importance. And then over time, as the community learned about the value of the site, then they also became involved in trading a piece of land close to the Savannah site for another acre somewhere else where they might build a building away from the site. So it was through education and through, I got to say, stubbornness, through conviction, that we were able to eventually piece. It was originally the site was less than 100 acres. It was around 92 acres, but now it's about 130 acres because over time, our own community members contributed and or traded off parcels that we could attach to the site, so that we're about 130 acres now. And our last acquisition that we attached to, that we brought in under the Black Oak Savanna, was the adjoining wetland. So that's my best example of local activism in protecting our own biodiversity, species at risk, you name it. We've been involved with the Habitat Stewardship Program for species at risk for 20 years now. or it's called AFSAR now, the Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk. We even won an International Pollinator Award and went to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington and collected the little 4-inch trophy. But a lot of notoriety came with that. So that's my best example of how we were able to accomplish something, you know, positively at the local First Nation area.
Natalia, did you raise your hand there?
Yeah, just great discussion. And I wanted to piggyback again on some of the comments. And Mike mentioned, you know, compensating farmers for either restoring wetlands or keeping them in good health. And there are a few groups in Canada who are engaged in these models. And one that comes to mind is ALUS Canada. They're active across Canada, and that's exactly what they do. I know in my own remarks, I mentioned that there are different municipalities across Canada that are now going through systematic inventories of natural assets, including wetlands that may fall within their borders. And one group that helps municipalities conduct these inventories and then work through various engineering studies and so on to actually bring it to dollars and cents value is Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, or MNAI group. They're based in BC, but they work all across Canada to help local governments assess this value. And, you know, some municipalities now go as far, because they're not allowed to bring the value on financial position statements. They include these values in notes to financial position statements. So anyway, the readers get to see the value of natural assets in reviewing these notes. But part of the question was, who are these unlikely other audiences that should be engaged so that we see more conservation dollars, I suppose, and restoration dollars flowing towards wetlands. And to me, one of the biggest untapped or maybe underutilized groups is like the financial audience. So I think many have heard about the use of green bonds to fund projects like renewable energy projects or clean transportation projects and so on. But, and overall, you know, 95% of all green bond proceeds go towards renewable energy and clean transportation, energy efficiency type of projects. Only 5% of all of green bond use of proceeds globally go towards adaptation and resilience. But there are good examples where green bond use of proceeds have indeed supported wetland restoration work. And there's one that comes to mind more recently. City of Toronto issued a $200 million green bond recently, and they allocated 44 million of that money towards work on Portland's flood protection project. And as part of that work, there are over 1,000 meters of new river channel that are created at the mouth of Don River, 13 hectares of new coastal wetland, 2-hectare wetland patch connecting the ship channel, and there's a whole bunch of other wetland type of projects that are supported with that $44 million use of proceeds. But in order, again, to win financial type of audiences over and bring their attention to the wetland conservation restoration projects, it's important to be very clear in terms of what kind of expected benefits and returns there might be realized through the project implementation.
I am aware of that project, and it has struck me as a great irony that at the one hand, we're spending all of this money to restore wetlands to the coast of Lake Ontario, and on the other hand, we're issuing MZOs to eliminate them. But I think I should, in the interest of time, as I know we were scheduled to conclude 5 minutes ago, turn things back to Philippe. But thank you so much for all of your contributions and for coming to celebrate World Wetlands Day with us here.
Yes, so definitely we've had a lot of questions from the public. As I said, a lot of the questions actually have been answered by our panelists, and some were just reactions or very positive comments. So I would say this brings us to the end of this evening and the World Wetlands Day celebrations here in Waterloo for 2021. So I'd like to thank again, of course, Dr. Rooney, as our distinguished lecturer, and also for the panelists, and particularly for the positive intake of the panel discussions, showing that there are solutions that we can move forward. Of course, I'd like to thank all the attendees and also point out again, we have a survey, and so if you could fill in the survey, that would be really very nice. So to all of you, stay safe and healthy, and may we meet again next year for the next World Wetlands 2022 celebrations. Good night, and thank you so much.
Thank you.